For this video, we're going to be talking about how you can use transparent base to increase the sense of atmospheric depth in your prints. And so I find it easiest to start with the transparent base and then gradually add some color. I'm thinking about maybe a purplish tones, purplish blue. So I've got my phthalo blue, I've got my quinacridone violet, and then we've got transparent base. So to start with, I just want to get sort of our base purple going so that I can put the other inks away. So I'm going to get a little bit of blue out here, and then a little bit of red. Not a ton of red, I want it mostly a blue tone, but I'll pre-mix those two on the inking slab so that we have kind of a purple. And then we'll be adjusting the intensity of that purple with transparent base in order to create a more atmospheric image. Out of the way. Make sure you've got a clean scrap of mat board or a putty knife to get your transparent base out so that you don't contaminate the color. And we're going to start out with mostly transparent base. So we're going to do a very, very sheer color to start with. So mostly transparent base. And then I'm just going to touch just a tiny bit of the purple in there. So there's hardly any there on the cardstock. I'm going to mix it in. Mix it a little bit with the card first before you get it on the roller, and then you'll spread it out. So just a real light touch there will help spread it pretty thickly on the slab. So remember to keep these layers pretty thin. If you find that you've got too much ink, like I do, you can hear that slurping. Instead of just spreading it out wider and wider and making a big table of ink in front of you, take a second and just scrape some of it off and then spread out what's left. So kind of pull off maybe half of that and then redistribute what we've got left. Even that's a little bit thick there. We're going to be putting 3 or 4 layers on here, so we don't want to start with such a heavy layer that later layers of ink are not going to be able to attach. So if you're not sure how much ink, try less than you think you're going to need. Alright, so here is my inking plate. I've already got it positioned on my template, and I'll be rolling it out pretty thinly. It still looks quite blue. I guess we don't have a lot of red in there yet, but maybe we can adjust with a little bit more purple in a minute here. So I'm putting this on nice and thin. I'm not too worried about where the edges of that image are. I'll be using a template or a kind of a frame of like a thin plastic transparency to keep the image all right in my 6x8 rectangle. So nice thin layer there. And then we'll put our little temporary frame over top to kind of clean up the edges there. And I think I will just hinge it to my template sheet so I can just flip it out of the way next time without peeling it completely off. And a piece of tape there. Alright. Now my fingers, I notice, are really pretty messy, so if I touch my printmaking paper now, I'm going to get ink on the margins of the paper. So I'm going to just kind of quickly take a wet wipe and get off as much ink from my fingers as I can. This ink tends to get on everything if you're not careful. So clean hands, gently handle your printmaking paper. I think I want to use the slightly rougher side down so that I get a little bit more of that textural pattern. Gently layer it on there. And I will hinge my paper since we'll be pulling this paper back and replacing the ink 2 or 3 times. I want to make sure that the image always drops back in the same spot. So I'll use a little bit of artist tape or the blue painter's tape to tack that down at the top edge. you can attach it to either edge, but just remember you need room to flip stuff out of the way. So usually I flip my paper up in one direction, and then if I have that little frame of acetate, I'll flip that out in a different direction. If you're at the edge of a table, you can also flip it down so that it's in front of you, but then you're more likely to end up getting ink on your legs and other things. So I usually like to flip the paper up out of the way, away from me. Alright, so let's think about, again, I don't have much of a plan for an image here, but let's kind of think of something that might be like a woodland scene, possibly. So I'm going to start with a little bit of pressure in the background to kind of suggest some landforms, and then let's just do a few small trees. So we're going to put in a few little trees in the background. I'm just using a piece of mat board on its corner, and pretty light pressure, but I want to kind of suggest that there are some kind of distant trees first, and then we'll be adding in some other trees that are a little bit darker and closer to us. You also might think about the amount of focus that you want there. If you press really hard with a sharp pointed object, you might get too much camera clarity back there. It's almost like you want some parts to be slightly out of focus, and then you want greater contrast and greater clarity, usually in the foreground, but you can adjust that a little bit. So just to take a quick peek, we're getting some soft kind of smoky values in the background first. Maybe do a little bit of like clouds or other forms back there. And you can add some tone in the foreground too. A lot of this will get covered up with later areas as we add more detail in the foreground. So flip that out of the way, and then we don't even have to necessarily clean this off. If we're using the same colors over and over again and just making the colors more intense, we can just add more ink to our transparency and continue from there. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more ink. We've still got quite a bit of transparent base in there, but we want it to be slightly a stronger intensity of ink than the last layer. So I want to try to have, let's shoot for at least 3 different layers of value. So I want to make sure I flip my stencil out of the way first. That would not be great to ink over the top of that. So fold that out of the way, and then we'll just add a little bit more of the stronger ink. You could change the color slightly too. I mean, I'm making it more intense, but if you wanted to shift the color so it's slightly more purple or more greenish, you could do that at this stage where you're adding the second color. So we've inked up with the second color that's a little bit less transparent base. It's got more pigment. We smooth our frame down on top of the plate to keep our margins nice and clean, and carefully reposition the paper. Now we're going to add the second layer of depth. So again, I don't want to press real hard. I don't want to get fingerprints and things up there, but we're going to start bringing in a little bit more information. So let's bring in some other trees that are maybe a little bit lower down in the page that hopefully are going to start appearing to be closer to us than these trees that were drawn with the lightest color of ink. So we're getting a little bit darker value there, and then we'll come in with our darkest color last. So I think I will shift it a little bit more toward the red if we can. Let's see. Yeah, there's a little more red on this. And this will be our darkest value. here I want to be kind of careful not to press it all down because, oops, what I forgot to do is put our frame in first. I'm glad I stopped at the last minute there. So put your, protect your edges again from the ink, and then drop the paper down. And again, this time I'm hoping to only press in the trees that are going to be in the foreground. So maybe we do a little bit larger trees. Oh, I just tore the paper. Shoot. Could have had a piece of buffer paper on there since I was pressing so hard. And maybe I'll use something that's not quite so sharp here. So let's put a bigger tree, maybe a little bit more detail on this one. So maybe a little more linear work. Branches. Try not to put my fingers on top of the image. I don't want to get fingerprints showing through. Plant or a bush or something there. Maybe some shadows to kind of help suggest a ground plane. And maybe one more kind of tall tree here that's a little bit lower on the page than the ones that are printed in the lighter ink. Make the baseline a little bit more close to the bottom edge of the composition. And then maybe we do one here at the edge too. Okay. So you can see this paper is so delicate that ink is actually transferring through it. That's another good reason to have a little bit of buffer paper. Since we've got 3 layers of ink here now, the paper's almost saturated, so we're still on the back side, but it almost looks like we're on the front of the print. So let's pull that up and look what we've got. Okay, we'll take it off of the paper. And this ghost image could be kind of interesting too. I might try to print that in a second. You can see where I've torn the paper. There's a little hole here in the paper, and we'll put it on a black piece or a white piece of paper so we can see a little bit better. While it's wet, you might be able to just coax that little tear mark flat again, and if it ends up getting mounted on a piece of paper, we could end up gluing that down, but that's unfortunate that I ripped through there by pressing too hard. So there's still, it's a little splotchy. If there were places you absolutely wanted to keep white, we could have stenciled that out with a piece of paper. If you're afraid that things are going to get too dark by the time you get to that last color, that would be an option to use a stencil, and we'll talk a little bit more about stencils in another video. But I think that's a good spot to stop on this one. So try one where you're adding transparent base. Use a lot of transparent base for your first value, and then add a little bit more ink for 2 or 3 more layers, and see if you can get a suggestion of a range of tones that creates more atmosphere.